Welcome to the Granny Square series. This video we're going to be making this square here, and we're using lots of puff stitches. So if you're a beginner, you may want to start with the regular puff stitch square, as that's slightly easier than the square we're going to be making today. For the demo, I'm going to be using this Stylecraft Special DK acrylic yarn in Wisteria and a 4mm hook. So let's get started. So to begin, I'm making a double magic circle and chain 1. So for our first stitch, we're going to make a 3-loop puff stitch. Yeah, so I'm going to pull that chain up to the height of a US double, UK treble. I'm going to yarn over once, go in, pull through, yarn over twice, go in, pull through, and then yarn over a third time, go in, pull through. We're then going to yarn over and pull through all those loops. Chain 1. We're going to make a second puff stitch into the magic circle. So again, 3 loops, once, twice, and 3 times. Yarn over, pull through all the loops. We're not going to chain 1, we're just going to make a US double. That's a UK treble. So all the stitches are going to be either US doubles, UK trebles, or puff stitches. So rather than keep switching between UK and US, I'm just going to call it a puff stitch or a standard stitch, yeah? So we've just made a puff, stitch, chain 1, puff stitch, standard stitch, and now we're going to make another puff stitch. Again, a 3-loop puff stitch. And chain 1. And we're going to repeat that from that chain 1. So we're going to make a puff stitch, don't chain 1, just make the standard stitch, and then another puff stitch. Now we make a chain 1 and we repeat. So we're going to make a puff stitch, a standard stitch, a puff stitch. Yeah, and then we're going to chain 1, and I think, so now we've got 1, 2, 3 groups plus that first puff stitch we made at the start. We've chained 1, so we're going to finish that group that we started. So we're going to make a puff stitch, oops, then make a standard stitch, and then we're going to slip stitch. So we're going to tighten our circle up, oops, and get the tail out of the way, and then we're going to slip stitch into the top of the first puff stitch. Yeah. And then we're going to slip stitch into that chain 1 space. So those chain 1 spaces are now our corners. Yeah, and we're going to chain 1. So that's how it should look. at the end of round 1. It's quite a lot of stitches, isn't it? It feels like, so that's why I said it's probably not the best one if you're a beginner. Okay, round 2. So we're going to start off by making a puff stitch. We've already chained one at the end of round 1. So we're just going to pull that up to the height of a standard stitch and make a 3 loop puff stitch into that chain 1 space. Yeah, and then going to chain 1 and we're going to make another puff stitch. 3 loop puff stitch. Don't chain 1, we're just going to make a standard stitch into that chain 1 space again. Yeah, and then another puff stitch into the same space. Chain 1. We're going to hop across to the next chain 1 space. Yeah, so that's going to be our next corner. So we're going to make a puff stitch. A standard stitch. And then a puff stitch. We're then going to chain 1 and we're going to repeat that. So we're going to make a puff stitch, a standard stitch, a puff stitch. And then the standard stitch and my last puff stitch in this space. Yeah, chain 1 and we're going to hop across to the next corner, so the next chain 1 space. Yeah, so we're going to do the same thing. We're going to make a puff stitch, standard stitch and a puff stitch. Chain 1 and repeat. So we're going to make a puff stitch, a standard stitch and a puff stitch. Chain 1 and we're going to hop across to the next corner, the next chain 1 space, and repeat. So a puff stitch, a standard stitch and a puff stitch. Chain 1 and we'll repeat those 3 stitches again. So a puff stitch, standard stitch, puff stitch. Yeah, so when you've made that third stitch, you're going to chain one, and we're back at where we began. Yeah, so we just started by making one puff stitch for the corner of this edge. So we're going to make a puff stitch in there. This is a bit fiddly, yeah. And then a standard stitch. And then we're at the end of the round, so we're going to slip stitch into there, into the top of that puff stitch, and then we'll slip stitch into the chain one space, so the corner, yeah, chain one, and that's the end of round 2. Round 3, we've already made that chain one. We're going to pull that up to the height of a standard stitch, and we're going to make a puff stitch. Chain one. We're now going to make 3 stitches, a puff stitch, standard stitch, puff stitch into that same chain one space. Yep. And back in for the standard stitch. Try not to get your yarn snagged. And then the puff stitch. Chain one. We're going to make a standard stitch into that chain one space from round 2, chain one, and then we're going to go into the corner, into the chain one space. Yeah, so we're going to make a puff stitch, a standard stitch, and a puff stitch. Chain one, and repeat. So puff stitch, standard stitch, puff stitch into this chain one space. Chain one, and make a standard stitch into the chain one space, chain one, and we're at the next corner, so we're going to repeat. Yeah, same thing into that corner. We'll make a puff stitch, standard stitch, puff stitch, chain one, and then the puff stitch, standard stitch, puff stitch, chain one, make a US double, UK treble, standard stitch in here, and then around to the next corner, and so on until we get to here. So you can press pause and carry on, and I'll meet you back at the first corner. So when we get back to that first corner, we've just made a chain one, and we're going to go into that first corner that we started in to make a puff stitch. It's a bit fiddly once you get to that first corner again. And then a standard stitch. That's the US double, UK treble. And then to finish off, we're going to slip stitch into the top of the first puff stitch we made, and then slip stitch into the chain 1 space and chain 1. And that's how your square should look at the end of round 3. So round 4, we've already chained 1 at the end of round 3. So we're going to start our corner. We're going to make a US single, UK double, and then chain 1, and that counts as our first stitch. We're then going to chain 2 to make the corner. We're now going to make 2 stitches in here, standard stitches, US doubles, UK trebles. Oops. So we're now going to make 2 stitches in the top of these 2 stitches. Yeah, so we're going to go into the top of the first puff stitch, which is actually that standard stitch, yeah, and then into the next one. So we actually skip the first puff stitch. So we've now got 4 stitches along that edge. We're now going to make 2 stitches into the chain 1 space. Hop across to the next chain 1 space and make 2 more stitches. We're going to make 2 stitches in the top of these puff stitches. So again, when you go into the top of this puff stitch, it's actually this standard stitch. So 1, and then into the next one, 2, and then we're going to go into the chain 1 space, make 2 stitches, chain 2, and then 2 more stitches. We're going to make 2 stitches across the top of that puff stitch group. And we're back to the chain 1 spaces. Whoops, sorry. So 2 stitches in the chain 1 spaces each. Back to our puff stitch group, so 2 stitches in the top of those. And we're at the next chain 1 space, so 2 stitches. Chain 2, and 2 more stitches. Two stitches across the top of the puff stitch group. And 2 stitches into the chain 1 space. Two stitches into the next chain 1 space. Two stitches into your puff stitch group. And we're at the next corner, so 2 stitches. chain 2 and 2 stitches. Two stitches across the top of the puff stitches. I know there's 3 stitches there, but it just ends up better spaced if we do it this way. And then 2 stitches into the chain 1 space. Two stitches into the next chain 1 space. Oops. 2 stitches across the next puff stitch group. And we're back to the beginning. So we're going to make one last stitch into that corner. And then we're just going to slip stitch into the corner to join. And that's the end of round 4. We've finished our square. Well done. I hope you like this square, and I'll see you in the next video.